They called her too plain, but they didn't know what she was hiding. The words, a careless whisper from the judge's table, drifted across the stage, sharp and distinct despite the muffled thrum of the audience and the saccharine swell of pageant music. Too plain. I saw Lily flinch, a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of her shoulders beneath the stiff, borrowed satin of her gown. Her smile, already a fragile thing I'd painstakingly helped her construct backstage with reassurances and a tube of coral pink lipstick, wavered like a candle flame in a sudden draft. My breath hitched. From my seat in the third row, close enough to smell the cloying mix of hairspray and perfume that hung heavy in the auditorium air, I watched my 11-year-old daughter, Lily. Her hands, encased in pristine white gloves that were a size too big, were clasped tightly in her lap. The synthetic curls of the auburn wig we'd chosen, chestnut glow, the box had cheerfully declared, cascaded around her small, serious face, a stark contrast to the delicate, almost translucent skin of her cheeks. Beneath the carefully applied foundation and blush, a faint blue vein throbbed at her temple, a tiny, visible pulse of her anxiety. She was a study in miniature, a porcelain doll brought to life, and then asked to hold an impossible pose. The stage lights, relentless and unforgiving, bounced off the rhinestones sewn onto the bodice of her dress, scattering fractured rainbows across the velvet curtain behind her. But they seemed to miss her, somehow. Or perhaps she was simply absorbing their brilliance, drawing it inward, leaving nothing on the surface for them to see. Too plain. The phrase echoed in the hollows of my own chest. Plain. It was a word that felt like a dismissal, a judgment passed not just on her appearance for this one afternoon, but on her very essence. And it wasn't true. Not in the way they meant it. My Lily was a universe of quiet complexities, a landscape of subtle emotions and profound strength. But how could they see that, these arbiters of glitter and poise, when all they were looking for was a reflection of their own narrow expectations? I wanted to stand up, to shout, "She's not plain. She's extraordinary. You just don't have the eyes to see it." I wanted to stride onto that stage, gather her into my arms, feel the scratch of the sequins against my cheek, and carry her away from this world of forced smiles and superficial scrutiny. Home, to the quiet sanctuary of her room, where her worn copy of The Little Prince lay open on her nightstand and her sketches of fantastical creatures filled notebooks. Home, where she didn't have to be anything but herself. But I stayed rooted to my velvet seat, my own hands twisting a crumpled program in my lap until the paper was soft and damp. This had been her decision, this strange, unexpected foray into the world of child pageantry. A world neither of us understood, a world I secretly, deeply, resented for making her feel, even for a moment, like she wasn't enough. Lily didn't move. She didn't look at the judges, nor did she glance towards me for reassurance. Her gaze was fixed on a point somewhere beyond the footlights, a point only she could see. Her lower lip trembled, just once. I saw the way she curled into herself, a subtle shift in her posture, as if trying to shrink, to disappear beneath the weight of the borrowed finery, the heavy wig, the expectations that felt like a leaden cloak. The rhinestones, meant to make her shine, seemed only to highlight her discomfort, her separateness. They weren't hers, these glittering adornments, and it felt as though her very skin was rejecting them. She was uncomfortable in the spotlight, that much was painfully clear. She wasn't one of the other girls, the ones who twirled and beamed with an almost terrifying confidence, their every gesture polished, their smiles practiced and unwavering. Lily was quiet, thoughtful. She chose honesty, always, over applause. Even now, with the judge's careless words hanging in the air, she didn't try to force a brighter smile, didn't attempt a coquettish tilt of her head. She just sat, small and still, absorbing the moment. And then, something shifted. I saw it in the set of her jaw, a faint, almost imperceptible hardening. Her chin lifted, just a fraction. Her fingers, still trembling, unclasped. Slowly, deliberately, she raised one gloved hand, then the other, towards her head. My heart hammered against my ribs. "No, Lily, don't," a voice screamed inside me, a primal fear of what? Exposure? Pity? More judgment? But another, quieter voice, the one that knew the steel in my daughter's spine, whispered, let her be. Star. With those trembling fingers, she reached up, not to adjust a stray curl, not to fix her smile, but to grasp the edge of the wig. The chestnut glow. A collective intake of breath seemed to suck the air from the auditorium. It started as a few isolated gasps, then rippled outwards, a wave of surprise and dawning comprehension. Time stretched, thinned. The pageant music, with its relentlessly cheerful tempo, seemed to falter, to become a discordant background noise. My own breath caught in my throat, a knot of fear and fierce, protective love. I remembered the first time I brushed her hair after the diagnosis, the soft, baby-fine strands clinging to the bristles, then falling, weightless, to the bathroom floor. Each strand a tiny heartbreak. Lily hadn't cried then. She'd simply watched, her reflection pale in the mirror, her eyes wide and accepting in a way that had shattered me. "It's just hair, Mommy," she'd said, her voice small but firm. "It'll grow back. Or it won't. It doesn't matter." But it had mattered. To me. To the world that seemed to equate long, flowing hair with girlhood, with health, with normalcy. The wig had been my idea, mostly. A shield. A way for her to navigate school, to avoid the curious stares, the whispered questions from other children, the pitying glances from adults. A way, I thought, to give her back a piece of what had been taken. Lily's fingers tightened on the wig. She closed her eyes for a fleeting second, as if gathering herself. And then, she lifted it. The wig came away smoothly, revealing the soft, pale down that had only just begun to regrow on her scalp, sparse and uneven, like the first tender shoots of grass after a long winter. Her bare scalp, vulnerable and unadorned, caught the glare of the stage lights. It shone. A profound silence descended upon the room. It was a silence so complete, so absolute, that I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights backstage, the nervous rustle of fabric as another contestant shifted her weight. The judges, moments before whispering their critiques, were frozen, their pens hovering over their notepads, their faces a mixture of shock and something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. Lily opened her eyes. She didn't look ashamed, or embarrassed, or defiant. She simply looked free. She held the wig in her lap for a moment, her gaze resting on the cascade of artificial curls as if seeing them for the first time. Then, she placed it gently on the floor beside her chair. She stood there, under the relentless lights, her head held high. The borrowed satin dress, the two big gloves, the lingering traces of makeup, they all seemed to fade into insignificance. What remained was Lily. Just Lily. Proud, in a way that made every sequin, every rhinestone, every carefully constructed illusion in that auditorium look small and cheap and utterly irrelevant. And suddenly, astonishingly, no one was judging her beauty. They were learning what it looked like. The memory of the doctor's office was still so vivid. It felt like a thin, transparent overlay on the present moment. Dr. Ramirez, her face kind, but her eyes shadowed with a weariness that spoke of too many difficult conversations. The room had been painted a calming, pale blue, but nothing about that day had felt calm. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic wipes and unspoken fears. Lily, then only 10, had been perched on the edge of the crinkly paper-covered examination table, her small legs dangling, swinging almost imperceptibly. She'd been tracing the patterns on her jeans with a fingertip, a habit she had when she was nervous or concentrating. "The tests confirm our initial findings," Dr. Ramirez had said, her voice gentle, but the words themselves landed like blows. "Leukemia. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia." The syllables were foreign, clinical, terrifying. I'd reached for Lily's hand, my own trembling so violently I was afraid I'd frighten her. Her small fingers, surprisingly cool, had curled around mine, a tiny anchor in the sudden, violent storm that had engulfed my world. I remembered looking at Lily, at her bright, inquisitive eyes, the sprinkle of freckles across her nose, the way her dark blonde hair, then thick and falling past her shoulders, caught the light from the window. How could this vibrant, energetic child, who climbed trees with fearless abandon and filled our home with off-key singing, be so ill? It felt like a cruel, impossible mistake. "We have a very good treatment protocol," Dr. Ramirez had continued, outlining the months ahead: chemotherapy, hospital stays, potential side effects. Hair loss was mentioned, almost as an afterthought, a cosmetic consequence in the face of life-threatening illness. But for a 10-year-old girl, it wasn't just cosmetic. It was a visible marker of her difference, a neon sign pointing to the battle raging inside her small body. Lily had listened, her expression unreadable. When the doctor paused, Lily had asked, her voice clear and steady, "Will I get to keep my books at the hospital?" Not, "Will I be okay?" or "Will it hurt?" but a practical, grounding question about her stories, her escape. Even then, her resilience was a quiet, steady flame. The months that followed were a blur of sterile corridors, beeping machines, and the rhythmic drip of 4 bags. The hospital became a second home, the nurses our extended family. I learned to navigate the labyrinthine hallways, to decipher medical jargon, to advocate fiercely for my child's comfort and care. I slept in uncomfortable reclining chairs, my body aching, my mind a constant whirl of worry and prayer. Lily endured it all with a stoicism that humbled me. There were tears, of course. Moments of frustration when the nausea was overwhelming, when the fatigue pinned her to the bed, when she missed her friends, her school, her ordinary life. But mostly, she was brave. She drew in her sketchbook, creating vibrant worlds filled with dragons and talking animals, a stark contrast to the muted tones of her hospital room. She read voraciously, devouring books as if they were a lifeline. The hair loss started subtly. A few extra strands on her pillow in the morning, more than usual in her hairbrush. I tried to be nonchalant, to brush it away, both literally and figuratively. But Lily noticed. She'd run her fingers through her thinning hair, a thoughtful, almost detached expression on her face. One afternoon, as I was gently brushing what remained, a significant clump came away in my hand. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Lily, watching my reflection in the small mirror she held, met my eyes. There was no panic in hers, only a quiet understanding. "It's okay, Mommy," she said, her voice soft. "Dr. Ramirez said it would happen." "I know, sweetie, My voice trailed off. I couldn't articulate the pain I felt, the injustice of it all. She reached up and touched her own scalp. "Maybe I'll look like a cool warrior princess," she mused, a faint smile playing on her lips. The day we decided to shave it all off was a turning point. It was her decision. The constant shedding, the patchiness, it was becoming more distressing than the idea of being bald. I remember the buzz of the clippers, the soft fall of the remaining wisps of hair onto the towel draped around her shoulders. When it was done, she'd looked at herself in the mirror for a long time, her small hand tracing the unfamiliar smoothness of her scalp. She didn't look like a warrior princess. She looked small and fragile, and so incredibly brave it took my breath away. The wig. That came later. As she moved towards remission and the prospect of returning to school, the idea of a wig surfaced. It was my suggestion, fueled by my own anxieties. I wanted to protect her, to shield her from the inevitable stares and questions. I envisioned her walking back into her classroom, looking normal, as if the past year had been nothing more than a bad dream. We went to a specialist wig shop, a place filled with disembodied heads crowned with every imaginable hair color and style. The air smelled faintly of synthetic fibers and hairspray. Lily had been quiet, overwhelmed. Trying on the wigs felt like a betrayal of her own hard-won acceptance. Each one felt foreign, itchy, a costume she didn't want to wear. "They don't feel like me, Mommy," she'd whispered, her eyes welling up as she looked at her reflection, a stranger with perfectly coiffed hair staring back. We'd settled on the chestnut glow, a style that was soft and relatively unassuming, the closest we could find to her natural color and texture before the illness. It was an expensive purchase, an investment in a semblance of normalcy I desperately craved for her. She wore it, dutifully, to school. She wore it when we went out. But I knew, deep down, it was more for my peace of mind than for hers. It was a barrier I'd erected, hoping to soften the world's gaze. The pageant. That had been the most unexpected detour of all. A flyer, tucked into a community newsletter, advertising the Little Miss Starlight pageant. I'd almost thrown it away. Pageants were not our world. But Lily had seen it. She'd picked it up, her brow furrowed in concentration as she read the details. "Could I do this?" she'd asked, so quietly I'd almost missed it. I was stunned. "A pageant, sweetie? Are you sure?" My mind raced. The makeup, the dresses, the focus on appearance, it felt like everything we'd been fighting against. Everything that was superficial in the face of what truly mattered. "I don't know," she'd admitted, her gaze distant. "But they all look so confident. Maybe if I could do something like this, something hard and pretty, maybe I'd feel more like myself again." Her words were a soft blow to my heart. More like myself again. She wasn't talking about her hair. She was talking about an inner confidence, a sense of normalcy that had been eroded by months of illness and isolation. Perhaps, I'd thought, this wasn't about vanity at all. Perhaps it was about reclaiming a part of herself, about proving, in her own way, that she was still here, still capable, still Lily. So, I'd agreed, with a heart full of trepidation. We'd navigated the unfamiliar territory of pageant preparation, borrowing a dress from a neighbor whose daughter had outgrown it. Watching YouTube tutorials on stage makeup, my attempts clumsy and amateurish. Practicing a talent Lily had chosen to recite a poem, her favorite, by Mary Oliver, about wild geese and finding your place in the world. It was an unconventional choice, but deeply, uniquely Lily. The wig was a given, of course. For the pageant, it felt non-negotiable. She had to look the part. At least, that's what I told myself. That's what the unspoken rules seemed to dictate. Now, watching her stand on that stage, the discarded wig a small, sad heap of synthetic hair on the floor, I realized how wrong I'd been. My attempts to shield her, to make her fit in, had only served to muffle her true light. The silence in the auditorium was heavy, thick with unspoken emotions. I could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on my daughter. My own heart thrummed a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a mixture of fear for how this would be received, and an overwhelming surge of pride that threatened to spill over in tears. Lily didn't shrink under their gaze. Instead, she seemed to draw strength from it. Her posture, which had been hunched and uncertain moments before, straightened. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It wasn't the practiced, pageant-perfect smile she'd been attempting earlier. This was genuine. This was Lily. Backstage, before her group had been called, the atmosphere had been a chaotic whirlwind of glitter and nerves. Girls in varying states of readiness flitted about, their mothers and helpers fussing over last-minute details. The air was thick with the scent of hairspray, a suffocating cloud that made my eyes water. Sequins crunched underfoot. Bobby pins, like fallen soldiers, littered the floor. Lily had been sitting quietly on a folding chair in a corner, her hands clasped in her lap, the chestnut glow wig feeling, I knew, like a heavy, itchy helmet. The borrowed dress, a confection of pale blue satin and tulle, felt stiff and unfamiliar. The zipper had strained slightly at her back when I'd done it up, a reminder that she was still so slender, still rebuilding her strength. I knelt beside her, trying to offer words of encouragement, but they'd felt hollow even to my own ears. "Just be yourself, sweetie," I'd murmured, tucking a stray synthetic curl behind her ear, though the gesture felt absurd. How could she be herself when she was encased in so much artifice? She'd given me a small, one smile. "I'll try, Mommy." A gust of nervous energy had swept through the backstage area as a harried-looking coordinator announced, 5 minutes for the Junior Miss Division. Ladies. 5 minutes. Lily's breath had hitched. I saw the panic flare in her eyes. This was it. This was the moment she'd both dreaded and, perhaps, secretly hoped for. My own stomach churned. Was this a mistake? Had I allowed her to take on too much, too soon? The desire to see her feel confident, to reclaim some part of her childhood, had warred constantly with my instinct to protect her from any further pain or disappointment. It was then, amidst the crescendo of backstage chaos, that I think the shift began. Another contestant, a girl with a cascade of perfect blonde ringlets and a dazzling, professionally applied smile, had swept past, her mother trailing behind her, spraying a final cloud of glitter hairspray. The girl had glanced at Lily, a quick, dismissive up-and-down look, before turning to her mother and saying, in a stage whisper that carried easily, "She doesn't really look like she belongs here, does she?" The words, though not as direct as the judge's later comment, were like a tiny, sharp pinprick. I saw Lily's shoulders slump, her gaze drop to her lap. My own anger flared, hot and quick, but before I could say anything, Lily looked up at me. Her eyes, usually so soft and gentle, held a new, unfamiliar spark. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something quieter, more resolute. "Mommy," she said, her voice barely audible above the din this week. It's not me." I knelt, taking her small, gloved hands in mine. "I know, sweetie. It's just for a little while." She shook her head, a small, decisive movement. "No, I don't want to wear it. Not anymore." My heart leaped into my throat. "Lily, are you sure?" They're about to go on stage. The implications of her walking out there, without the wig, in this setting, were enormous. It was a defiance of every unspoken rule of this glittering, superficial world. "I'm sure," she said, her voice firmer now. Her eyes met mine, clear and unwavering. There was no fear in them, only a quiet determination. "I don't want to hide anymore. It's okay if they see me. The real me." Tears welled in my own eyes. This wasn't the outcome I had envisioned when she'd first expressed interest in the pageant. I'd imagined her, perhaps, gaining a little confidence, enjoying the dressing up, maybe even winning a small, insignificant ribbon. I hadn't anticipated this moment of profound, unscripted courage. "Okay, sweetie," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "Okay." My fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by an immense wave of love and pride. If this was her decision, I would support her. Unconditionally. Her fingers, still trembling slightly, went to the edges of the wig. She hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath. Then, with a small, decisive tug, she pulled it free. The chestnut glow came away, and she held it in her hands, looking at it almost with a sense of detachment, as if it were an artifact from a life that no longer belonged to her. The change in her demeanor was immediate. It was as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She sat up straighter. The hunted look in her eyes softened, replaced by a calm resolve. She smoothed down the soft, sparse fuzz on her scalp with a self-conscious but not ashamed gesture. "Better?" I asked, my voice gentle. She nodded, a small, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "Much better." When her group was called, she stood up, took a deep breath, and walked towards the stage entrance with a quiet dignity that belied her years. I watched her go, my heart swelling. She was about to face the lights, the audience, the judges, not as the perfectly coiffed doll they expected, but as herself. Brave, vulnerable, and utterly, incandescently real. The silence that had fallen when Lily removed her wig was so profound it felt like a tangible thing, a thick blanket smothering the usual pageant buzz. On stage, Lily stood, the discarded wig a small, forgotten heap of auburn curls on the polished floor beside her. Her bare scalp, with its soft, new growth of downy hair, gleamed under the bright lights. It wasn't an act of defiance, not in an angry or confrontational way. It was simpler and far more powerful than that. It was an act of pure, unadulterated honesty. She didn't try to explain. She didn't offer a speech. She simply stood there, her small frame straight, her chin held at a level that spoke not of arrogance, but of a quiet self-possession. The pale blue satin of her dress, moments before a symbol of her discomfort, now seemed to frame her fragility and her strength in equal measure. The two big white gloves suddenly looked poignant, a child's attempt to navigate an adult world of artifice. I watched the judges. Their initial shock was palpable. One woman, with elaborately styled silver hair and a string of pearls, had her pen frozen midair, her mouth slightly agape. Another, a younger man with a sharp suit and a critical expression that had earlier unnerved me, now looked thoughtful. His brow was furrowed, not in judgment, but in what seemed like genuine contemplation. And then there was the third judge, a woman whose kind smile I'd noticed earlier. Her eyes, when they met Lily's, glistened. Slowly, she reached up and dabbed at the corner of her eye with a delicate finger. The audience was a sea of blurred faces, their collective gaze fixed on my daughter. The initial gasps had subsided, replaced by an almost reverent hush. I could feel the shift in the room's energy, a ripple of understanding, of empathy, spreading outwards. It was as if Lily, by removing her wig, had also stripped away a layer of pretense from everyone present. Then, something extraordinary happened. One of the other contestants, a girl perhaps a year older than Lily, with a confident stage presence and a dress that shimmered with 1,000 sequins, had been standing a few feet away, poised for her own moment in the spotlight. She looked at Lily, her expression initially unreadable. Then, a slow, hesitant smile spread across her face. She took a small, almost imperceptible step towards Lily, a tiny gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes in the charged silence. It wasn't pity. It was respect. My own emotions were a maelstrom. The fear I'd felt for her was still there, a faint tremor in my hands, but it was now overlaid with an immense, soaring pride. My daughter, my quiet, introspective Lily, had found her voice not in words, but in a single, courageous act. She had refused to be defined by their standards, by their expectations. She had, in her own gentle way, redefined the terms. The silence stretched, becoming not awkward, but profound. It was as if everyone in that auditorium was holding their breath, waiting. Waiting for what? I wasn't sure. Lily finally broke the spell. She turned her head slightly and her eyes found mine in the audience. And then, she smiled. A real smile. Not the tentative, coached smile of earlier, but a radiant, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes and lit up her whole face. It was the first time I'd seen her truly smile all day, perhaps all week, through the stressful preparations and my own anxious fussing. It was a smile of relief, of liberation, of pure, unburdened joy. That smile was my undoing. Tears, hot and sudden, pricked at my eyes and began to trail down my cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness, or even of relief, exactly. They were tears of awe. Awe at her courage, her quiet strength, her unwavering authenticity. The moment couldn't last forever. The pageant machinery, momentarily stalled, would eventually grind back into motion. There would be scores, announcements, winners. But in that suspended moment, none of it mattered. Lily had already won something far more valuable than any crown or sash. She had won back herself. When her group was eventually ushered off the stage, the spell broken by a slightly flustered announcer, Lily walked with a new lightness in her step. She came directly to me, weaving through the backstage clutter. In her hand, she still carried the chestnut glow wig, holding it loosely by its synthetic strands. She stopped in front of me, her eyes shining. She didn't say anything. She simply held out the wig, offering it to me. I took it, the lifeless curls cool against my palm. It felt symbolic, this transfer. She was handing back the disguise, the shield I had thought she needed. She was telling me, in her own quiet way, that she was whole without it. "You were amazing, sweetie," I whispered, my voice choked. I reached out and gently touched her cheek, then her soft, downy hair. "So incredibly brave." She leaned into my touch, a small, contented sigh escaping her lips. "I just wanted them to see me, Mommy," she said softly. Later, after the pageant had concluded, Lily didn't win, of course, not by their standards, but it felt utterly irrelevant. As we walked out of the auditorium into the fading afternoon light, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't anticipated. The air outside was cool and fresh, a welcome contrast to the stuffy, perfumed atmosphere of the pageant hall. Lily walked beside me, her hand tucked into mine, her step light and unburdened. She was chattering about the poem she'd recited, about the girl who had smiled at her, about the funny hat one of the judges was wearing. The weight of the day, the pressure, the artifice, had all fallen away. They called her too plain, but she showed them what beauty really is. It wasn't in the perfect curls, or the flawless makeup, or the dazzling dress. It was in her quiet courage, her unyielding honesty, her willingness to stand in her own vulnerable truth. It was in the gentle strength that shone from her, brighter than any stage light, more captivating than any sequin. And in that moment, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my daughter was the most beautiful girl in the world.